start by sharing some stories that I've discovered. So we'll begin on September 22nd, 1862, when Abraham Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Did you know there was a preliminary one? Okay. Its third paragraph reads, that on the first day of January in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, henceforward, and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons or any of them in any efforts they may make for their actual freedom. But as that January 1st fateful day approached, Lincoln was making a last-ditch effort to advance his colonization plans, an approach some scholars suggest was rooted in Lincoln's belief that blacks and whites could not live peaceably together in the United States of America. So whatever Lincoln's motivations were, Brown University historian Michael Borenberg writes this: the last day of 1862 was a busy one for Abraham Lincoln. Aside from his daily trudge to the War Office, which was in the wake of the recent Union Army defeats in the east at Fredericksburg and in the west at Vicksburg, a gloomier and ghastlier place than ever, the commander-in-chief also had to make final preparations for his boldest measure so far, the final Emancipation Proclamation, which he was to sign that day. The next day, early in the day, he presided over the final discussion of the proclamation with his cabinet. That afternoon, with painstaking care, he began to write out the final document. Late into the night and into the dawn, Lincoln finished the document, although perhaps still not to his satisfaction. He knew, as he told Senator Charles Sumner, the name connected with this document will never be forgotten. On that same day, continuing with the Borenberg quote, December 31st, 1862, Lincoln connected his name to a document that many of his adherents and later apologists would gladly forget. A contract with Bernard Koch, an ambitious and unscrupulous venturer, to use federal funds to remove some 5,000 black men, women, and children from the United States to a small island off the coast of Haiti. It was Lincoln's last effort at colonizing blacks outside of the United States, executed only one day before he was to sign a proclamation putting into effect the first official effort at permanently freeing the slaves. Haiti. Haiti's been in the news, hasn't it? And we'll talk a little bit more about Haiti later on. Meanwhile, that night, New Year's Eve, 1862, black Presbyterians waiting for the word, the fulfillment of the word, the reaping of the fruits sown by and through their faith, suffering, prayers, prophecies, and an eschatological realization of God's divine plan. And I quote again from Borenberg. At the Shiloh Presbyterian Church in New York, Reverend Garnett was presiding. Hymns were sung, speeches delivered, pews filled up as midnight approached. The Reverend announced that a hero of abolitionism had just walked in. I allude to Honorable Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley. The audience rose and applauded. Then Garnett noticed something. Greeley was clapping. He corrected himself. A gentleman right here before me looked so much like Mr. Greeley, I thought it was him. But when I mentioned Mr. Greeley's name, he clapped as hard as the rest. And then I saw my mistake. The congregation laughed with the reverend. And as the hour approached, Garnett called for order, and from 11:55 until midnight, he led a silent prayer. Down in Philadelphia, in a crowded First African Presbyterian church, Pastor Jonathan C. Gibbs had a sermon prepared for when the news arrived. It began, "The morning dawns, the long night of sorrow and gloom is past. Rosy-fingered Aurora, early born of the day, shows the faint first blush of her coming glory. Low down on the distant horizon of freedom's joyful day, O day thrice blessed, that brings liberty to 4 million native-born Americans. The proclamation has gone forth, and God is saying to this nation, by its legitimate head, man must be free." So as that joyous morning dawned, the Civil War was not yet won. Slavery still remained in Union border states, which is something a lot of people don't realize, that those border states were not impacted by the Emancipation Proclamation. And in areas of the Confederacy where enslaved people could not reach or find a safe harbor in the vicinity of Union troops. So not everyone was free at that point. So fast forward a couple years to Sunday, February 12th, 1865. Reverend Henry Highland Garnett, protege of Reverend Theodore S. White, who last week we mentioned was the first black graduate of Princeton Seminary. And this Henry Garnett was the same pastor we just talked about, who called out Horace Greeley at Shiloh Presbyterian Church. He is also the same guy that in the 1850s locked horns with none other than Frederick Douglass. And they fought over how the slaves should be free. Garnett actually advocated for armed insurrection to free the enslaved back in the 1850s. But Garnett also presciently warned, we may cross the Red Sea, but Pharaoh will still be on the other side. Prescient words. But on that Sunday in 1865, Presbyterian minister Henry Garnett became the first black person to ever speak in front of Congress. Taking as his text Matthew 23, verse 4, "For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers." Garnett compares his audience to scribes and Pharisees that are indicted by Jesus in this text. And the fiery sermon is a full-throated condemnation of white Christian hypocrisy, cruelty, passivity, and faithlessness to both the Gospels and the principles of democracy. In his address, Garnett deftly challenges, chides, cajoles, and as he moves towards his conclusion, beseeches. And I quote Garnett, "We ask no special favor, but we plead for justice. While we scorn unmanly dependence, in the name of God, the universal Father, we demand the right to live, labor, and to enjoy the fruits of our toil. The good work which God has assigned for the ages to come will be finished when our national literature shall be so purified as to reflect a faithful and just light upon the character and social habits of our race." When our national literature, keep that in mind as we go forward too. Garnett continues, "Favored men, honored of God as his instruments, speedily finish the work which he has given you to do. emancipate, enfranchise, educate, and give the blessings of the gospel to every American citizen. On April 9th, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Exactly 3 months later, a dispatch arrives from North Carolina at the offices of the New York Times. Okay. And I'm going to ask you to hand these out. We're going to do a little newspaper reading. Amazing what you can find in the New York Times Wayback Machine. So imagine you're sitting in New York or maybe Massachusetts, and it is it is June 30th, 1865, and you're picking up your morning paper. So dispatch. Dateline, June 30, 1865. New York Times from Raleigh, North Carolina. The vital question in many minds here is of Negro suffrage. The friends of the freedmen see some difficulty in securing the rights which the government evidently meant he should have when he was made free, unless he be allowed to vote in the management of civil affairs. Yet there is general agreement, I am told, throughout the state that the Negro is not now qualified for exercising wisely the elective franchise. If the state is allowed to settle that question by its white voters as heretofore, the blacks will be given no power in the matter at present. The Negroes are very numerous upon the streets, they and the bluecoats, like the Union soldiers, constituting the great part of the visible population in Raleigh, with a generous sprinkling of poor white trash. At market time in the morning, I think the blacks are not more idle or inefficient than any other class of freed slaves might be expected to be when so suddenly cut loose. That some are drones, and when winter comes will meet the fate of drones, none can tell. And the government will do more, much more, to get the interior and helpless through this coming winter. But after another crop has matured, there need be no suffering for want of food. Some will die from the sloth and the filth and exposure. Those who weather the first trials of transition will rise up a more brave, resolute, and energetic race than they could ever have become in slavery. The law will be verified here as 1,000 times before. Good men here and good men from the North are already at work for the education and elevation of the colored people, especially in the organization of schools and furnishing them with elementary school books. The American Bible and the American Tract Societies have representatives here who are forming their committees for the forms of Christian to which these societies are adapted. The work of religious reconstruction is going forward, hopefully. The work of religious reconstruction. Now, I read that and it kind of hit me with a little bit of an irony there. Somewhat paternalistic. Kind of ignorant, too. Which brings us to the topic.
Not high marks for holistic and invidious.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Really.
Well, we'll discuss how objectivity really isn't a thing later when we talk about historiography. But let's just say, first of all, black people have always had religious traditions. The origins of black religious traditions go as far back as time immemorial. Let's think about Christianity. Who was the first convert to Christianity? help us. Now, there's a little bit of like, some people say one person, another, but Eusebius, who is one of the church fathers, says the first, and in the book of Acts, very first convert to Christianity was a black Ethiopian eunuch. Now, eunuch, I did a paper at seminary on the word eunuch. It's a course for another day. But we can say, according to the book of Acts, the first convert to Christianity was a black person.
Still.
Right. And that Ethiopian, according to Acts and Eusebius, was in the service of the Queen of Ethiopia. And, legend has it went back and has helped establish the church in Ethiopia. Coptic and Ethiopian Orthodox churches predate all but the Church of Rome. So we have the establishment of the Christian church in Rome, but the next two were in Egypt, which is in Africa, and Ethiopia. So any notion that black people had to come to America to be exposed to Christianity is false. Now, African traditional religions, the scholar Gayrod Wilmore, who we'll be talking about more later on, talks about how those religions were syncretized with Christianity, with Islam, and in some places with Judaism as well. That Africa was not this tabula rasa. Black people did not come to this country without religious tradition. What they did come here with was a pragmatic way of incorporating what worked for them in their context. Albert Rabbitoe, who is a historian of black religion, talks about the church the black church in America as the invisible institution. And we're going to kind of pick up during the point of slavery. Rabbitoe, when he talks about the African traditional religions, notes that they really had no sacred text, but they did generally recognize one high God, but that one high God was immanent. That one high God could be present, was present with the people, and that the material and spiritual spheres were not necessarily as separate as we, white folks tend to make them. And time was not linear. That spirit world, the material world, there was liminal space between them, and that time could circle back and forth. And that worship and ritual were embodied, and invoking intervention, protection, and action from God was part of that religious tradition. So we know from last week, in many cases, enslaved people were prohibited from reading the word. Nonetheless, they became very astute hearers of the word. They would often, as we talked about, go with their enslavers to the church, where they would hear white pastors, right? At the same time, there was a tradition of slave pastors. There were places called hush arbors and praise houses where the enslaved would go, and a slave preacher who had heard the words, or maybe that slave knew how to read and had read the gospel, would preach and exhort and explain. So the enslaved people developed a dual consciousness. What they were hearing from white ministers versus what they knew about themselves, what they were hearing from the exhortation of slave preachers and the praise houses and the hush harbors versus what was happening to them and around them. So we see this development of a black religious tradition, and we just talked about Henry Garnett. There were freed black preachers in the North, in the Presbyterian tradition, who founded independent black churches. And they were constructing a theology that was pointed, as we heard from Garnett, and was unafraid of calling out the hypocrisy of white preachers. Not only were those black preachers in the Presbyterian tradition in the North speaking to their own congregations and their own settings, we'll see later on as emancipation happened, they were very active in supporting the church in the South too. I want to move to back even a little bit further, talk a little bit about the Great Awakenings and how they impacted black religion. You may recall from last week we talked about something called there are two Great Awakenings in American history. The one was like around 1740, the other a little bit later. But those movements were evangelical in nature and included revivalism. White and black preachers would go out on horseback and hold camp meetings, hold revival meetings, with the intention of winning people to Christ. Their approach was egalitarian, emotional, and the idea is that one could, by one's own volition, accept Jesus Christ as one's Lord and Savior. Right? Now, we also talked last week a little bit about this old school, new school Presbyterianism. And like Peter, I don't want to get too far into it. But the controversy between the old and the new school had a lot to do with this revivalism. Old school Presbyterians did not look kindly on conversion via revival, and there are some theological reasons for that. They also, old school folks, insisted upon an educated clergy, a clergy educated at a Princeton, at a Columbia, at a Union. So what these Great Awakenings did was you had Baptists and you had Methodists out there inviting black and white people to convert, to give their hearts to Jesus. The Presbyterians, by and large, weren't out there doing that. So when people ask, why are there so many more Baptist and Methodist black folks? Well, this is part of the reason why. That during the Great Awakening, those two denominations were out there evangelizing. But that insistence upon education also created some barriers too for the development of black churches when there was an insistence that everyone, white or black, had to be educated to lead a church. So, in the North, where you had black people were allowed to go to Princeton, black people weren't allowed to go to Union or Columbia for quite some time. So there's some tension there. So we have this black church that has developed, that has come out of traditions from Africa, melding, syncretizing with exposure to American Christianity. But what's going on with the white church? What's going on in white theology at this time? I'm going to fast forward a little bit to, this is a book, actually a really good book I recommend. by Bradley Longfield, published in 2013, called Presbyterians in American Culture. So I'm going to give you all a bibliography at the end of our class today so we can look at that. But Longfield goes into a lot of detail about, and I use this term our first meeting, what I call a deformation of the white church in the South. And we're going to talk about kind of a intellectual tradition that starts in the 1840s and goes forward. But Longfield says, Christianity gave to blacks moral order, a sense of justice, dignity, psychic space, and hope. While white Presbyterians debated the proper Christian response to slavery, blacks expressed the Christian theology of suffering, hope, and victory in a way that transcended their own social situation. Against the abolitionists' claim that slavery was against the law of love and the Golden Rule, James Henry Thornwell, the South's leading Presbyterian divine, argued that the rule applied only to equals. Our Savior, Thornwell declared, directs us to do unto others what in their situation it would be right and reasonable for us to expect from them. The Golden Rule simply requires, then, that we should treat our slaves as we would want to be treated if we were slaves ourselves. Thornwell goes on to argue that slavery was not a curse but a blessing. And that in the providence of God, he claims, these bondsmen have been torn from their country and placed under Christian masters for their salvation. Numbers of them have been joined to Christ, while their brethren at home are worshipers of the devil. If slavery would not exist among perfected people in the state of glory, it might last as part of God's plan until the end of the millennium. Okay. Now, have you ever heard of the term millennialism? Okay. So Thornwell's saying, God, in God's time, when God is ready for this to end, God will end it, right? But in the meantime, the slaves are benefiting from this, and what we need to do is try to treat them really well, or relatively well. But going forward, in an 1851 sermon, Thornwell declared that the church has no commission to construct society afresh, to change the forms of its political constitutions. He continues, the church can announce what the Bible teaches, enjoin what it commands, prohibit what it condemns, and enforce her testimonies by spiritual sanctions. Beyond the Bible, she shall never go. What we just heard is the concept of the spirituality of the church, a concept Mark Knoll has noted that can be explained as a convenient doctrine allowing Southern Christians to avoid taking action on slavery. But it was also, in fact, a sincerely held religious conviction related to the rejection of political Whig ideology and Northern Calvinist activism. This doctrine, which was prominent in border states and in the South, would become especially influential in Southern Presbyterianism in the years after the defeat of the Confederacy. So, we have two Presbyterian streams of theology, both actually rooted in a millennialist idea. The black church always knew that God acts in history. There's a salvation history, and God is active in that human history. Now, DCPC gave me $2,000 as a lovely gift before I went to seminary. Did y'all know that? Yeah. And so every now and then I feel the need, I have to drop a $2,000 word on you just to prove I learned something. Heilgestieg. Heilgestieg is a German word that means salvation history. There's your $2,000 word. But both of these traditions had, while they may not have used the German word, had an understanding that God's providence, God's activity happens in history. Now, what happened on that watch night when back at Shiloh and back in Philadelphia? Wow, that's the realization of God's divine providence. The expectation has come to fruition. But for the white Southern Presbyterian, wow, a crisis of faith. So, wait a minute. Okay, you're saying God's going to take care of this in God's time? Well, God just took care of it, right? Well, we've got to retune our theology now, because what we wanted to happen didn't happen. So this doctrine of the spirituality of the church kind of built that we're going to kind of recointer in and focus a lot on the doctrinal purity. Because when you look at the arguments that start up after emancipation and after the end of the Civil War, there's a shift. The arguments start in about Darwin. Darwin's Origin of Species was published in 1859. Talk a lot about personal piety. Really, let's hammer on those drunk people. Don't be drunkards. So this refocusing on doctrinal purity, on personal piety, but at the same time, we'll discuss more next week, there was a lot of political activism happening by Presbyterians in the enactment of Jim Crow. Moving ahead, Reconstruction. I'm going to give you all another handout that just provides a timeline. There are a lot of good resources, and when I give you the bibliography, you'll see that there are some online documents that if you want to dig into the, Bill's a history teacher, the dates, the events, what happened, particularly in North Carolina during that period of time from 65 to 77, 1865 to 73. I'm not going to spend any time on that really, because it's stuff that you can learn. But what I would like to talk about briefly is a concept called historiography. Simply put, historiography is the study of history and how it is written. So this is a timeline of events in North Carolina for your edification. So historiography entails the critical examination of sources, methods, and assumptions at play in the presentation and interpretation of human events. So it's a study of how we do history. And be sure to pipe in historian over here. So I want to raise this issue because I went to high school in the early 80s, and I don't remember maybe one day at best. And I went to a pretty decent school and took AP history, and I don't remember much coverage at all about that period of Reconstruction. What do you guys remember, Bill?
I went to high school in Michigan, tiny rural town near Lansing, but not part of Lansing, and had, I think, an astonishingly good history teacher. And we had to, one day, she said, "Tell me what caused the Civil War, here are your resources." And this is in the early 60s, and she put us in groups and did modern kinds of things. And we came up with 150 different things, big long lists on the board. We read Kenneth Stamp's The Peculiar Institution, which is a pretty damning book about slavery. I moved here in 12th grade. Didn't take U.S. history, I'd already done that. But my brother was taking it in 9th grade at the time. Very different approach. But I went back when I was in college studying to be a teacher. One of our assignments was find your U.S. history book, whatever you had in high school, and analyze one topic. Well, I chose slavery because my recollection 3 or 4 years later is this really good thing. I found the book very quickly. It was still in use. I found 2 references to slavery. The first of which was 1619 or something like that.
Yeah.
And the second of which was the slaves enjoyed their work. They showed it by singing in the fields. And I remember thinking, I don't think those were joyful songs. I think they were maybe codes and so forth. So my recollection is this really good class, but it didn't come from the book. The books were, and this was universal across the country. That led me to looking at a dozen or so different books. They were dreadful. And you were 20 years later than me, but they didn't get much better. Quick, fast forward, in 1990, 88 maybe, a professor at Johnson C. Smith did a workshop for CMS teachers on teaching Black history in Charlotte. There were 6 white teachers, I think, all middle school. I was 8th grade at the time. And it was an astoundingly good class. But there were 15 or 20 Black teachers and 6 white teachers. To my knowledge, it's never been repeated. And it was not mandatory. I just happened to notice it, wanted to get some renewal credits, and thought this could be interesting. It was an extraordinary class. It's pretty mixed here. And the curriculum, that gave me all kinds of material about local history, which 8th graders were far more interested in than the big stories. But I think it's still very poorly done. Right now, I'm tutoring our Afghan refugees in Huntersville, 3 teenagers, all taking American history. They cut American history way back in high schools this year. They covered 50 to 1900 already. They're into Teddy Roosevelt and so forth. So it was this, and of course these kids got very little of it because they're just working on vocabulary and have 0 outline. So I still think it's very poorly taught. And teachers, with the exception of that one U.S. history teacher in Michigan, teachers are not trained to do it.
And that's by design.
Oh, I'm sure.
That's why I wondered, was it intentionally not put in the history books?
Well,
It's
Eric,
intentionally sanitized.
yeah,
in history.
Eric Foner wrote a wonderful book entitled Reconstruction, and I've read the updated edition. Foner says the scholarly study of Reconstruction began early in this century with the work of William Dunning, John W. Burgess, and their students. The interpretation elaborated by the Dunning School may be summarized as the following. It goes, the fundamental underpinnings of this interpretation was the conviction, to quote one of the members of the Dunning School, of Negro incapacity. The childlike blacks, these scholars insisted, were unprepared for freedom, and that blacks ought to take no part in government. These works abounded in horrified references to Negro misrule. And the fact is that blacks played little role in the narratives. Their aspirations, if mentioned at all, were ridiculed and their role in shaping the course of events during Reconstruction ignored. When these writers speak of the South or the people, they meant white people. Blacks appeared either as passive victims of white manipulation or as unthinking people whose animal natures threatened the stability of a civilized society. So from the very beginning, the study of the history of this era was shaped, informed by white supremacy.
What are Dunning states?
I think 1903.
Okay,
So right as none of you probably know the amendment of 1900. In August 15th, 1900, North Carolina had a vote that instituted the grandfather clause and poll tax and literacy tax and so forth. We were late to the game.
But this is, emerging out of Jim Crowism. And what Dunning and others did was they established kind of a status quo way of looking at history. Taking their ideology and retroactively kind of imposing it on the situations, events that were going on before them. I have to say, when I came to Davidson in 1983, I didn't take a history class here, even though I loved history, because women and black people were told, don't take classes in the history department. And part of that was because there were two professors who had been there for ages, who were proponents of the Dunning School and did not look kindly on the fact that women were at Davidson, and also kind of had this lost cause mythology approach to their teaching of American history.
You were told by your academic advisor?
No, it's the scuttlebutt, around.
Other students?
Yeah, they're like, oh, don't take a class from him. He doesn't like women, or he says things about blacks that aren't good. So from a historiographical point of view, looking back, this is the kind of stuff we absorbed, most of us. Some of us, if we're lucky, got the other part of the story. And that seeps into churches, as part of the culture. With that said, Reconstruction and the Northern Presbyterian mission to the North Carolina Piedmont presents some really interesting stories. Even before the end of the Civil War, the Northern Presbyterian Church was active in creating bodies to assist freedmen. And in 1866, I found an 1866 report from the General Assembly Northern Church Committee on Freedmen. And it says that and they had set up two committees to come into the South. And the work of these two committees, from necessity, was controlled to a large measure by the military lines, and chiefly happened in connection in military camps and hospitals. The committee determined to sustain and enlarge the work where it began and to take possession of other points as fast as Providence would open the way and the church would provide the means and missionaries. A number of missionaries actually in the field were theological students. But the report goes on to say that, let's see, it is, I'm sorry, I lost my place. It says the church has called his people to do this work, and that through his grace his people will be led to hear the call. And the committee will go forth unfailingly, and the work will be to the faith of God and the church. Laborers must be found to take the place of those leaving the field at a definitive date, or these stations occupied will be lost and their fruits will not be gathered. And it goes on to delineate the three goals that of this committee. Number one is to secure funds and obtain for the cause of religious culture of the freedmen a place in the hearts and prayers of Christian people. So doing the work of changing hearts and minds. Second, to enlist and send out laborers for the right spirit and qualifications. The third is the location and control of missions in schools. Okay? But, sounds good. I mean, they were down here working. And in fact, Charlotte, North Carolina, was one of those first mission fields. We know that there were many, many Scotch-Irish settlers here in the Piedmont region, many Presbyterians, and therefore many black people who had been part of white Presbyterian worshiping committees or communities. But there was a call to establish black Presbyterian churches, and one of them was First United Presbyterian Church of Charlotte. Okay. So in Charlotte, and as I said, in other places, black slaves worshiped in the churches of their white masters. The First Presbyterian Church of Charlotte, that one downtown you all may know, was actually established in 1832, which is 5 years before us. But after the end of the war, black people who were developing their own religious ideologies and traditions wanted to have their own spaces. So a white Presbyterian minister who was originally from Philadelphia but had gone to seminary at Columbia felt called to actually leave the white presbytery, which at that point in time was the Presbytery of Concord, to help create one of the first black governing bodies in the United States, a Presbyterian church, the Catawba Presbytery. And so Samuel C. Alexander was that man. And along with helping to establish the First United Presbyterian Church in Charlotte, he was also one of the founders of the Biddle Institute, now known as Johnson C. Smith University, which was founded in 1867 for the education of recently enslaved people. And it was initially named the Biddle Institute because of a bequest from a woman named Mary Biddle, who was from Philadelphia, who gave, at that point in time, a princely sum of $1,400 to help establish this institution. And meanwhile, another school started based on Presbyterian beginnings. It's Barbara Scotia Seminary, and that was primarily for women. Well, it was all women at that point in time. So white Presbyterians did get to work in the South, helping to assist black Presbyterians primarily in the fields of education and establishing their churches. So those partnerships started, but you heard that last line of the GA Commission, control. That will become an issue as we move forward. And I'll quickly try to wrap us up here. So meanwhile, what's going on up in Davidson? So we kind of have a sense of, Charlotte's starting to build a black church. They have the Biddle Institute now. Well, Davidson wasn't the bedroom community suburb of Charlotte that it is now. That 25 miles was a rutted muddy road. And so what went on in Charlotte didn't necessarily happen immediately up in Davidson. However, the Davidson College Commission on Race and Slavery simply says that from 1861 to 1865, that Davidson reflected the social, political, and economic investment in the institution of slavery. Faculty and students were generally pro-secession and supported the Confederacy. Former mathematics professor and chair D.H. Hill served in the Confederate Army, along with his brothers-in-law Rufus Barringer and Thomas Stonewall Jackson. And all three men married daughters of President Morrison, who's president of Davidson. These three generals are the most prominent Confederates connected to Davidson. Other students, faculty, and trustees supported the Confederate war effort, including working as military chaplains and other things. During the war and Reconstruction, the college largely remained open. So we had a question last week, did the college close? No, it didn't. And after the war, men who were formerly enslaved helped repair the college to stay open after the war and maintain the buildings. Following Reconstruction, the commission goes on, the college engaged in racial discrimination and segregation consistent with local practices during the Jim Crow era. So, and this is an interesting book, Jan Blodgett, One Town, Many Voices. Jan gives a perspective based upon the evidence that we have. There's a paucity of writing, of documentation about the lives of Black people in our community. But, you know, she still has some things to say about that, and I want to bring us to a landing spot with a quote from her. She goes, "To recover fully from the political and social effects of the war and Reconstruction years, Davidson would have to have a greater vision of racial equality than was possible at that time. The town did recover sufficient economic stability to survive and prosper as a small town, but it succumbed to the racial and class divisions of its time and place and formed patterns that left their traces on future generations."